Combray, Part 5. Unfortunately, I was not able to set at rest, by further talks with Bloch, in which I might have insisted upon an explanation, the doubts he had engendered in me when he told me that fine lines of poetry, from which I, if you please, expected nothing less than the revelation of truth itself, were all the finer if they meant absolutely nothing. For, as it happened, Bloch was not invited to the house again. At first he had been well received there. It is true that my grandfather made out that, whenever I formed a strong attachment to one of my friends and brought him home with me, that friend was invariably a Jew, to which he would not have objected on principle. Indeed, his own friend Swann was of Jewish extraction, had he not found that the Jews whom I chose as friends were not usually of the best type. And so I was hardly ever able to bring a new friend home without my grandfather's humming the O God of our fathers from La Juive, or else Israel break thy chain, singing the tune alone, of course, to an ti-tum, tra-la. But I used to be afraid of my friends recognizing the sound, and so being able to reconstruct the words. Before seeing them, merely on hearing their names, about which, as often as not, there was nothing particularly Hebraic, he would divine not only the Jewish origin of such of my friends as might indeed be of the chosen people, but even some dark secret which was hidden in their family. "And what do they call your friend who is coming this evening?" "Dumont, grandpapa. Dumont. Oh, I'm frightened of Dumont." And he would sing, "Archers, be on your guard, watch without rest, without sound." And then, after a few adroit questions on points of detail, he would call out, "En garde, en garde!" Or, if it were the victim himself who had already arrived, and had been obliged unconsciously by my grandfather's subtle examination to admit his origin, then my grandfather, to show us that he had no longer any doubts, would merely look at us, humming almost inaudibly the air of "What, do you hither guide the feet of this timid Israelite?" or of "Sweet vale of Hebron, dear paternal fields," or perhaps of "Yes, I am of the chosen race." These little eccentricities on my grandfather's part implied no ill will whatsoever towards my friends, but Bloch had displeased my family for other reasons. He had begun by annoying my father, who, seeing him come in with wet clothes, had asked him with keen interest, "Why, Monsieur Bloch, is there a change in the weather? Has it been raining? I can't understand it. The barometer has been set fair," which drew from Bloch nothing more instructive than, "Sir, I am absolutely incapable of telling you whether it has rained. I live so resolutely apart from physical contingencies that my senses no longer trouble to inform me of them." "My poor boy," said my father after Bloch had gone, "your friend is out of his mind. Why, he couldn't even tell me what the weather was like, as if there could be anything more interesting. He is an imbecile." Next, Bloch had displeased my grandmother, because after luncheon, when she complained of not feeling very well, he had stifled a sob and wiped the tears from his eyes. "You cannot imagine that he is sincere," she observed to me. "Why, he doesn't know me, unless he's mad, of course." And finally, he had upset the whole household when he arrived an hour and a half late for luncheon, and covered with mud from head to foot, and made not the least apology, saying merely, I never allow myself to be influenced in the smallest degree either by atmospheric disturbances or by the arbitrary divisions of what is known as time. I would willingly reintroduce to society the opium pipe of China or the Malayan kris, but I am wholly and entirely without instruction in those infinitely more pernicious, besides being quite bleakly bourgeois, implements, the umbrella and the watch. In spite of all this, he would still have been received at Combray. He was, of course, hardly the friend my parents would have chosen for me. They had, in the end, decided that the tears which he had shed on hearing of my grandmother's illness were genuine enough, but they knew, either instinctively or from their own experience, that our early impulsive emotions have but little influence over our later actions and the conduct of our lives, and that regard for moral obligations, loyalty to our friends, patience in finishing our work, obedience to a rule of life, have a surer foundation in habits solidly formed and blindly followed than in these momentary transports, ardent but sterile. They would have preferred to block, as companions for myself, boys who would have given me no more than it is proper, by all the laws of middle-class morality, for boys to give one another, who would not unexpectedly send me a basket of fruit because they happened that morning to have thought of me with affection, but who, since they were incapable of inclining in my favor, by any single impulse of their imagination and emotions, the exact balance of the duties and claims of friendship, were as incapable of loading the scales to my prejudice. Even the injuries we do them will not easily divert from the path of their duty towards us those conventional natures of which my great aunt furnished a type, who, after quarrelling for years with a niece to whom she never spoke again, yet made no change in the will in which she had left that niece the whole of her fortune, because she was her next of kin, and it was the proper thing to do. But I was fond of Bloch. My parents wished me to be happy, and the insoluble problems which I set myself on such texts as the absolutely meaningless beauty of La Fille du Minos et du Pacifique tired me more and made me more unwell than I should have been after further talks with him, unwholesome as those talks might seem to my mother's mind. And he would still have been received at Combray but for one thing. That same night, after dinner, having informed me, a piece of news which had a great influence on my later life, making it happier at one time and then more unhappy, having informed me that no woman ever thought of anything but love, and that there was not one of them whose resistance a man could not overcome, he had gone on to assure me that he had heard it said on unimpeachable authority that my great aunt herself had led a gay life in her younger days, and had been notoriously kept. I could not refrain from passing on so important a piece of information to my parents. The next time Bloch called he was not admitted, and afterwards, when I met him in the street, he greeted me with extreme coldness. But in the matter of Bergotte he had spoken truly. For the first few days, like a tune which will be running in one's head and maddening one soon enough, but of which one has not for the moment got hold, for the first few days the things I was to love so passionately in Bergotte's style had not yet caught my eye. I could not, it is true, lay down the novel of his which I was reading, but I fancied that I was interested in the story alone, as in the first dawn of love, when we go every day to meet a woman at some party or entertainment, by the charm of which we imagine it is that we are attracted. Then I observed the rare, almost archaic phrases which he liked to employ at certain points, where a hidden flow of harmony, a prelude contained and concealed in the work itself, would animate and elevate his style. And it was at such points as these, too, that he would begin to speak of the vain dream of life, of the inexhaustible torrent of fair forms, of the sterile, splendid torture of understanding and loving, of the moving effigies which ennoble for all time the charming and venerable fronts of our cathedrals. That he would express a whole system of philosophy, new to me, by the use of marvellous imagery, to the inspiration of which I would naturally have ascribed that sound of harping which began to chime and echo in my ears, an accompaniment to which that imagery added something ethereal and sublime. One of these passages of Bergotte, the third or fourth which I had detached from the rest, filled me with a joy to which the meagre joy I had tasted in the first passage bore no comparison, a joy which I felt myself to have experienced in some innermost chamber of my soul, deep, undivided, vast, from which all obstructions and partitions seemed to have been swept away. For what had happened was that, while I recognized in this passage the same taste for uncommon phrases, the same bursts of music, the same idealist philosophy which had been present in the earlier passages, without my having taken them into account as the source of my pleasure, what had happened was that I now no longer had the impression of being confronted by a particular passage in one of Bergotte's works, which traced a purely bi-dimensional figure in outline upon the surface of my mind, but rather of the ideal passage of Bergotte, common to every one of his books, and to which all the earlier similar passages, now becoming merged in it, had added a kind of density and volume. That ideal passage by which my own understanding seemed to be enlarged. I was by no means Bergotte's sole admirer. He was the favorite writer also of a friend of my mother's, a highly literary lady, while Dr. du Bourbon had kept all his patients waiting until he finished Bergotte's latest volume, and it was from his consulting room and from a house in a park near Combray that some of the first seeds were scattered of that taste for Bergotte, a rare growth in those days, but now so universally acclimatized that one finds it flowering everywhere throughout Europe and America, and even in the tiniest villages, rare still in its refinement, but in that alone. What my mother's friend, and it would seem what Dr. du Bourbon liked above all in the writings of Bergotte, was just what I liked, the same flow of melody, the same old-fashioned phrases, and certain others quite simple and familiar, but so placed by him in such prominence as to hint at a particular quality of taste on his part. And also in the sad parts of his books a sort of roughness, a tone that was almost harsh. And he himself, no doubt, realized that these were his principal attractions. For in his later books, if he had hit upon some great truth, or upon the name of an historic cathedral, he would break off his narrative, and in an invocation, an apostrophe, a lengthy prayer, would give a free outlet to that effluence which, in the earlier volumes, remained buried beneath the form of his prose, discernible only in a rippling of its surface, and perhaps even more delightful, more harmonious when it was thus veiled from the eye, when the reader could give no precise indication of where the murmur of the current began, or of where it died away. These passages in which he delighted were our favorites also. For my own part, I knew all of them by heart. I felt even disappointed when he resumed the thread of his narrative. Whenever he spoke of something whose beauty had until then remained hidden from me, of pine forests or of hailstorms, of Notre Dame de Paris, of Athalie, or of Phèdre, by some piece of imagery he would make their beauty explode and drench me with its essence. And so, dimly realizing that the universe contained innumerable elements which my feeble senses would be powerless to discern, did he not bring them within my reach, I wished that I might have his opinion, some metaphor of his upon everything in the world, and especially upon such things as I might have an opportunity some day of seeing for myself. And among such things, more particularly still upon some of the historic buildings of France, upon certain views of the sea, because the emphasis with which in his books he referred to these showed that he regarded them as rich in significance and beauty. But alas! Upon almost everything in the world his opinion was unknown to me. I had no doubt that it would differ entirely from my own, since his came down from an unknown sphere towards which I was striving to raise myself. Convinced that my thoughts would have seemed pure foolishness to that perfected spirit, I had so completely obliterated them all, that, if I happened to find in one of his books something which had already occurred to my own mind, my heart would swell with gratitude and pride, as though some deity had, in his infinite bounty, restored it to me, had pronounced it to be beautiful and right. It happened now and then that a page of Bergotte would express precisely those ideas which I used often at night, when I was unable to sleep, to write to my grandmother and mother, and so concisely and well that his page had the appearance of a collection of mottoes for me to set at the head of my letters. And so, too, in later years, when I began to compose a book of my own, and the quality of some of my sentences seemed so inadequate that I could not make up my mind to go on with the undertaking, I would find the equivalent of my sentences in Bergotte's. But it was only then, when I read them in his pages, that I could enjoy them, when it was I myself who composed them, in my anxiety that they should exactly reproduce what I seemed to have detected in my mind, and in my fears of their not turning out true to life, I had no time to ask myself whether what I was writing would be pleasant to read. But, indeed, there was no kind of language, no kind of ideas which I really liked except these. My feverish and unsatisfactory attempts were themselves a token of my love, a love which brought me no pleasure, but was, for all that, intense and deep. And so, when I came suddenly upon similar phrases in the writings of another, that is to say, stripped of their familiar accompaniment of scruples and repressions and self-tormentings, I was free to indulge to the full of my own appetite for such things, just as a cook who, once in a while, has no dinner to prepare for other people, can then find time to gourmandize himself. And so, when I had found one day, in a book by Bergotte, some joke about an old family servant, to which his solemn and magnificent style added a great deal of irony, but which was in principle what I had often said to my grandmother about Françoise, and when another time I had discovered that he thought not unworthy of reflection in one of those mirrors of absolute truth which were his writings, a remark similar to one which I had had the occasion to make on our friend Monsieur Legrandin, and moreover my remarks on Françoise and Monsieur Legrandin were among those which I would most resolutely have sacrificed for Bergotte's sake, in the belief that he would find them quite without interest. Then it was suddenly revealed to me that my own humble existence and the realms of truth were less widely separated than I had supposed, that at certain points they were actually in contact. And in my new-found confidence and joy I wept upon his printed page, as in the arms of a long-lost father. From his books I had formed an impression of Bergotte as a frail and disappointed old man who had lost his children and had never found any consolation. And so I would read, or rather sing, his sentences in my brain, with rather more dolce, rather more lento than he himself had perhaps intended, and his simplest phrase would strike my ears with something peculiarly gentle and loving in its intonation. More than anything else in the world I cherished his philosophy and had pledged myself to it in lifelong devotion. It made me impatient to reach the age when I should be eligible to attend the class at school called philosophy. I did not wish to learn or do anything else there, but simply to exist and be guided entirely by the mind of Bergotte. And if I had been told then that the metaphysicians whom I was actually to follow there resembled him in nothing, I should have been struck down by the despair a young lover feels who has sworn lifelong fidelity, when a friend speaks to him of the other mistresses he will have in time to come. One Sunday, while I was reading in the garden, I was interrupted by Swann, who had come to call upon my parents. "What are you reading? May I look?" "Why, it's Bergotte. Who has been telling you about him?" I replied that Bloch was responsible. "Oh, yes, that boy I saw here once, who looks so like the Bellini portrait of Mohammed II. It's an astonishing likeness. He has the same arched eyebrows and hooked nose and prominent cheekbones. When his beard comes he'll be Mohammed himself. Anyhow, he has good taste, for Bergotte is a charming creature." And seeing how much I seemed to admire Bergotte, Swann, who never spoke at all about the people he knew, made an exception in my favor and said, "I know him well. If you would like him to write a few words on the title page of your book, I could ask him for you." I dared not accept such an offer, but bombarded Swann with questions about his friend. "Can you tell me, please, who is his favorite actor?" "Actor? No, I can't say. But I do know this: there's not a man on the stage whom he thinks equal to Burma. He puts her above everyone. Have you seen her?" "No, sir. My parents do not allow me to go to the theatre." "That is a pity. You should insist. Burma in Phèdre, in the Cid. Well, she's only an actress, if you like, but you know that I don't believe very much in the hierarchy of the arts." As he spoke, I noticed, what had often struck me before in his conversations with my grandmother's sisters, that whenever he spoke of serious matters, whenever he used an expression which seemed to imply a definite opinion upon some important subject, he would take care to isolate, to sterilize it by using a special intonation, mechanical and ironic, as though he had put the phrase or word between inverted commas, and was anxious to disclaim any personal responsibility for it. As who should say, "the hierarchy, don't you know," as silly people call it. But then, if it was so absurd, why did he say "the hierarchy"? A moment later he went on. "Her acting will give you as noble an inspiration as any masterpiece of art in the world, as, I don't know," and he began to laugh, "shall we say the Queen of Chartres?" Until then I had supposed that his horror of having to give a serious opinion was something Parisian and refined, in contrast to the provincial dogmatism of my grandmother's sisters. And I had imagined also that it was characteristic of the mental attitude towards life of the circle in which Swann moved, where, by a natural reaction from the lyrical enthusiasms of earlier generations, an excessive importance was given to small and precise facts, formerly regarded as vulgar, and anything in the nature of phrase-making was banned. But now I found myself slightly shocked by this attitude which Swann invariably adopted when face to face with generalities. He appeared unwilling to risk even having an opinion, and to be at his ease only when he could furnish, with meticulous accuracy, some precise but unimportant detail. But in so doing he did not take into account that even here he was giving an opinion, holding a brief, as they say, for something, that the accuracy of his details had an importance of its own. I thought again of the dinner that night, when I had been so unhappy because mamma would not be coming up to my room, and when he had dismissed the balls given by the Princess de Leon as being of no importance, and yet it was to just that sort of amusement that he was devoting his life. For what other kind of existence did he reserve the duties of saying in all seriousness what he thought about things, of formulating judgments which he would not put between inverted commas? And when would he cease to give himself up to occupations of which, at the same time, he made out that they were absurd? I noticed, too, in the manner in which Swann spoke to me of Bergotte, something which, to do him justice, was not peculiar to himself, but was shared by all that writer's admirers at that time, at least by my mother's friend, and by Dr. du Boulogne. Like Swann, they would say of Bergotte, he has a charming mind, so individual, he has a way of his own of saying things, which is a little far-fetched, but so pleasant. You never need to look for his name on the title page, you can tell his work at once. But none of them had yet gone so far as to say, he is a great writer, he has great talent. They did not even credit him with talent at all. They did not speak because they were not aware of it. We are very slow in recognizing in the peculiar physiognomy of a new writer the type which is labeled great talent in our museum of general ideas. Simply because that physiognomy is new and strange, we can find in it no resemblance to what we are accustomed to call talent. We see rather originality, charm, delicacy, strength, and then one day we add up the sum of these and find that it amounts simply to talent. Are there any books in which Bergotte has written about Burma? I asked Monsieur Swann. I think he has in that little essay on Racine, but it must be out of print. Still, there has perhaps been a second impression. I will find out. Anyhow, I can ask Bergotte himself all that you want to know next time he comes to dine with us. He never misses a week from one year's end to another. He is my daughter's greatest friend. They go about together and look at old towns and cathedrals and castles. As I was still completely ignorant of the different grades in the social hierarchy, the fact that my father found it impossible for us to see anything of Swann's wife and daughter had for a long time had the contrary effect of making me imagine them as separated from us by an enormous gulf, which greatly enhanced their dignity and importance in my eyes. I was sorry that my mother did not dye her hair and redden her lips, as I had heard our neighbor, Madame Sazerat, say that Madame Swann did, to gratify not her husband but Monsieur de Charlus. and I felt that, to her, we must be an object of scorn, which distressed me particularly on account of the daughter, such a pretty little girl as I had heard, and one of whom I used often to dream, always imagining her with the same features and appearance, which I bestowed upon her quite arbitrarily, but with a charming effect. But from this afternoon, when I had learned that Mademoiselle Swann was a creature living in such rare and fortunate circumstances, bathed as in her natural element in such a sea of privilege, that, if she should ask her parents whether anyone were coming to dinner, she would be answered in those two syllables, radiant with celestial light, would hear the name of that golden guest who was to her no more than an old friend of her family, Bergotte; that for her the intimate conversation at table, corresponding to what my great aunt's conversation was for me, would be the words of Bergotte upon all those subjects which he had not been able to take up in his writings, and on which I would fain have heard him utter oracles, and that, above all, when she went to visit other towns, he would be walking by her side, unrecognized and glorious, like the gods who came down of old from heaven to dwell among mortal men. Then I realized both the rare worth of a creature such as Mademoiselle Swann, and at the same time how coarse and ignorant I should appear to her. And I felt so keenly how pleasant and yet how impossible it would be for me to become her friend, that I was filled at once with longing and with despair. And usually from this time forth, when I thought of her, I would see her standing before the porch of a cathedral, explaining to me what each of the statues meant, and, with a smile which was my highest commendation, presenting me as her friend to Bergotte. And invariably the charm of all the fancies which the thought of cathedrals used to inspire in me, the charm of the hills and valleys of the Ile de France and of the plains of Normandy, would radiate brightness and beauty over the picture I had formed in my mind of Mademoiselle Swann. Nothing more remained but to know and to love her. Once we believe that a fellow creature has a share in some unknown existence to which that creature's love for ourselves can win us admission, that is, of all the preliminary conditions which love exacts, the one to which he attaches most importance, the one which makes him generous or indifferent as to the rest. Even those women who pretend that they judge a man by his exterior only see in that exterior an emanation from some special way of life, and that is why they fall in love with a soldier or a fireman whose uniform makes them less particular about his face. They kiss, and believe that beneath the crushing breastplate there beats a heart different from the rest, more gallant, more adventurous, more tender. And so it is that a young king or a crown prince may travel in foreign countries and make the most gratifying conquests, and yet lack entirely that regular and classic profile which would be indispensable, I dare say, in an outside broker.